Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Robin Cameron and I am the Director of Engagement in the Department of Accounting, Finance and Economics here at Griffith University. And I have the pleasure of welcoming you to our panel session here today addressing COVID-19, the Australian Government's macroeconomic response. Before we begin, I would like to make an acknowledgement of country. So Griffith University acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting and pays respect to the elders past and present and extends that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We would also like to acknowledge the Shadow Treasurer, Dr. Jim Chalmers, who is joining us today in our audience. Dr. Chalmers is also a Griffith alumni, and we thank him for his continued support and participation. Just some quick housekeeping. Needless to say, we're hoping that our best friend today is the internet and that technology is on our side. Our session is being recorded, and could we ask you to please use the chat box if you have any questions that you'd like to ask in our question and answer session. The chat box is located on the right-hand side, lower corner of your screen. So over the past few weeks, we've heard that word unprecedented many times, including the unprecedented magnitude and scope of the current set of macroeconomic policies that has been witnessed globally and in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 Great Lockdown. And so today, our panel of experts will be discussing the pros and cons of the fiscal policy response to the crisis, the economic legacy of the response to the crisis, and possible reforms to restore and strengthen economic growth and employment post-crisis. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to today's panel of experts that we have with us. Our first presenter will be Professor Fabrizio Carminaghi from the Griffith Business School here at Griffith University. Fabrizio will be followed by Professor Renuka Mahadevan from School of Economics at University of Queensland, and then our colleague Professor Tony Macken from the Department of Accounting, Finance and Economics here at Griffith University will also speak. And we are fortunate to have today also as our moderator, Professor Sarah Davies from the School of Government and Industrial Relations at Griffith University. And so with no further ado as such, I will pass you over to Sarah. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Robin. My name is Sarah Davies. I'm a Professor of International Relations at the School of Government and International Relations at Griffith University, and I'm delighted to moderate this session today. I will hand over now to Fabrizio as our first speaker.
Perhaps I jinxed us by saying, needless to say, let's hope technology is on our side. Here he is, here's Fabrizio.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you,
Fabrizio. Thank you.
So,
sorry about that. So, as I said, in this initial statement, I would like to touch on 2 points. The first one relates to the policies that I believe are needed now in order to flatten the recession curve. And the second point is about the opportunities that I see for long-term economic reforms for Australia. Now, obviously, we all know that we are facing a deep recession with very large social and economic costs. I would also add that, in my opinion, this recession is not just the consequence of containment measures that are necessary in order to flatten the epidemic curve. In fact, the preliminary evidence that we have from Sweden, for instance, as well as historical evidence that we have from the time of the Spanish flu, would suggest that the recession curve without containment measures is not much flatter than the recession curve with containment measures. And containment measures, as we know, are important in order to avoid a spike in cases and deaths. Now, my view is therefore that containment measures are necessary. And what we need to do is to use economic policy in order to flatten as much as possible the recession curve, and in order to absorb as much as possible the social and economic costs of the shock that we are observing now. In order to do that, I believe that we need to address 4 key priorities. The first one is to strengthen the capacity of the healthcare system. Now, this is important to avoid a situation where there is a congestion, and as we know from the experience of European countries, a congestion of the healthcare system inevitably leads to a spike in the number of deaths. Now, this is right now not an issue for Australia, but it's important to be prepared in case there was a second wave. Of course, we all hope that there will not be a second wave, but it's important to make the investment. The second priority is to ensure that workers stay employed and collect their wages, again, as much as possible. The consequences of unemployment remain for the long term. As we know very well, if someone becomes unemployed today, then the probability to find a job in the future decline. At macro level, a spike in unemployment today will translate into higher long-term structural unemployment. We also want to avoid a situation where businesses have to let go workers today and then eventually go back and recruit new workers later on when there is a recovery. The process, the cost of recruiting new workers takes time and resources, and this might slow down the recovery. We also want to guarantee that households and families maintain a certain level of consumption, and that's important why we want to provide guarantee in terms of collecting wages, and if that's not possible, we need to have a strong plan of subsidies. Now, all of these, of course, requires a lot of intervention. Wage subsidies are important, and different countries are going about this problem in different ways, but the general idea is to support employment and the payment of wages through strong public intervention. The third priority is around ensuring that businesses that are solvent but illiquid do not go bankrupt. So we've got plenty of businesses that are illiquid, even though underlying they are solvent. So we don't want these businesses to go bankrupt, because if they go bankrupt, then when the recovery comes, new businesses will have to be reconstituted. And again, this will take time and resources and might slow down the recovery process. In order to avoid these bankruptcies, we have to consider a program of loan and grants, but also the possibility to postpone the payment of some fixed costs, like, for instance, certain type of taxes and rents and similar items. The last priority is about ensuring and maintaining the liquidity and stability of the banking system. We know from previous experience that the negative effects of a contraction are propagated and amplified through the banking system. We have to do all what is necessary to avoid a credit crunch in this situation. Now, how do we achieve all of that? Well, in my opinion, fiscal policy has to step up. There isn't much that we can expect from cutting the interest rate more down to zero. Central bank obviously has a very important role in terms of ensuring the stability and liquidity of the banking system, as I said. But at the end of the day, all those measures that I mentioned in terms of subsidies and loans and interventions in support of workers, families, and businesses has to come from fiscal policy. Obviously, that will imply a deficit. It's inevitable. And so the question is, how do we pay for that? My view is that Australia is in a relatively comfortable position. The level of debt in proportion of GDP is relatively low. Even if we were to have an increase in debt by 20, 30 percentage points, we would still be in a situation in a band of sustainability, particularly if you consider that the interest that we pay on debt is still low. Quantitative easing could be, or a similar monetary bazooka can be used in order to guarantee the long-term interest rates remain low. However, and that's a possibility, if we don't like the idea of increasing debt so much, we could think under these very exceptional circumstances to financing expenditure directly by printing money. Obviously, that's not something that I would recommend under normal circumstances. But in this particular case, it's something that can be put on the table, in my opinion. I don't see a risk of hyperinflation, which is the reason why I would normally never recommend the monetization of expenditure. But in this case, and in this very exceptional case, it is something that we might want to consider. So let me conclude by looking now at the opportunities for the long term. I see in particular three possible areas of structural reform. The first one is rethinking the role of fiscal policy. I think it's important that we finally realize that fiscal policy is a tool to achieve a greater good. The purpose of fiscal policy is not just to balance the budget no matter what. The second opportunity that I see is more investment in the labor market through active and forward-looking policies that support the structural transformation of the Australian economy. I'm thinking of policies that support the mobility of workers across sectors. I'm also thinking of policies that prevent the emergence of phenomena like long-term unemployment and underemployment, which lead to a sclerosis of the labor market and ultimately to greater inequality. The third and probably most important priority, in my opinion, is that we need to develop a vision for a sustainable and inclusive long-term growth in Australia. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to choose now a sector that will be driving economic growth in Australia in the future. These type of choices usually fail. What we need to do instead is to develop a vision around a program to support and encourage innovation and real entrepreneurship. I say real entrepreneurship because I refer to entrepreneurs who are actually willing to invest in research and development to innovate whatever it is that they are doing. So we need to have this program, this vision around supporting innovation and entrepreneurship across all sectors of activity. There will be inevitably failures. There will be R&D projects that go nowhere. But failures are not a problem in this situation. It's part actually of an evolutionary process, if you want, at the end of which successful innovation will emerge. New innovative sectors will emerge and will be driving the type of sustainable and inclusive growth that we need for the long term. So, Sarah, thank you very much for the opportunity. I'll stop here and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. May I now kindly ask Renuka to be our next speaker?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you. And we can see you.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. So what I'm going to do is basically to draw upon a couple of economic concepts to depict the current situation. And then I'll talk a little bit about the recovery for some of the sectors post-COVID. And finally, a little bit on the government intervention and to possibly touch on taxation as a potential tool. So in this way, I hope to add to Fabrizio's spiel. Okay, so by and large, Australia has been a laissez-faire sort of economy. So you left things to the market mechanism. But when such an external shock with regards to the COVID happens, naturally it is very important for government to step in. And we see that we saw that in terms of the depression, whereby you have a lot of government expenditures. So a lesson to learn from the past. Perhaps more concerning, it's really the threat of the government winding back some of the schemes that it has put in place sometime end October. So here again, we can draw upon a lesson from the past, and that is the big bang approach versus the gradual approach. So in the 80s, and whereby when economies were opening up, so here I'm referring to the communist economies, and China took on a gradual approach to reform some sectors, slowly opening up to also open up to competition. Whereas we saw Russia take on the big bang approach, everything was quick, there was poor coordination, and that didn't work very well. So the lesson really is not to wind back everything all at the same time. So the gradual sort of approach would be the way to go. But I would also argue that the government needs to dig into its pockets deeper and also reach out in a wider sort of intervention. So why do I say that? That's because you have the sectors which will recover at different speed. So currently there has been a decline, and then the recovery would see an uptake. So there is like a V-shaped recovery that would be in place quite soon. Now, not all sectors would recover at the same pace. So for instance, when the cafes and restaurants open up, or the hairdressers, salons opening up, so those kinds of face-to-face services would pick up very quickly. But then we've got the other sectors, for instance, the education sector. And we know that universities, for instance, are very reliant on the international market. So there should be more sort of help provided in the terms of the job losses due to the revenue. The airline industry, of course, is the other big one. And there has been, Qantas has been given some help, and now there is a discussion about whether Virgin should be helped. And the argument there is to provide some help to Virgin so that there's competition. So whatever the sector, the thing is they're all going to recover quite differently. Perhaps one sector that may need less help could be tourism. So tourism actually contributes to 3% of the GDP. It may surprise some people that 75% of the revenue from tourism comes from the domestic tourism and 25% from international tourism. So with all the borders closed, we would expect that domestic tourism is quite well poised to pick up or compensate for the lack of international tourism. So I've just digressed a bit, but all I wanted to say is different sectors, the response would be different. But also there is a hidden cost to this recovery, and one of it is in terms of the mental health issues. So we've got a new chief medical officer just especially for mental health. So and we can expect expenditure on health to increase quite a bit, and also with regards to domestic violence issues. So social service expenditure can also be expected to increase. So by and large, of course, this is all going to add to the budget deficit. I would just want to add one point to what Fabrizio mentioned about what the government can do. In my view, infrastructure development is key. So any sort of projects that have been put on the back burner, for instance, the roads, or with regards to social housing, or even with regards to school maintenance, things that should really come on quickly, and that's to create the jobs. So we've talked about the fact that generally there is going to be a huge deficit. So some tax analysts have discussed the fact that it might be time to review the tax system. So naturally in this environment, tax cuts may not sit very well because the government needs revenue from some channel. So we can expect tax cuts not to happen. The other sort of approach was also to go after the big companies like Facebook and Google and the MNCs. But again, this may not necessarily be the right time to do that because we do want them to create jobs. So what suggestions have been put forward is that there could be greater scrutiny in terms of tax evasion. The Australian Taxation Office has put the figures of tax evasion to something like 30 to 35 billion. So what we can expect is that people who have been cheating or not quite declaring their tax, there would be a bit a harder force on them, as well as tax concessions in terms of some deductions provided may now be taken away. Yes, I agree with Fabricio that it's not all that important to balance the budget, but nevertheless, there needs to be some sort of plan B in terms of where some revenue can be obtained. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the new normal stage that we talk about, where we've got consumers will be adjusting in terms of perhaps doing more online shopping, or workers have a change in the environment that they work in, maybe more people work at home. But apart from these stakeholders, there is also the government. So the government also needs to get onto a new normal form of governance. And the manner in which the governance takes place, or the speed with which, or the type of fiscal policies that are going to be in place, that's going to be of utmost importance. Never has there been a time whereby the importance of fiscal policy and the effectiveness of it will be on display for all to see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renuka. I would now like to introduce Tony to be our last speaker from the panel. Thank you. I'll stay on, Tony, until I can see you and hear you. I can see you and I can hear you. Great.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Hello.
Maybe
everybody.
just a little bit louder. Sorry, your volume's just a little bit low. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Sound okay?
That's
good. Okay. Hello, everybody. Let me start by thanking the organisers, Robin, Pavinda, Michelle, and Sarah, for moderating this session on a topic of utmost importance to us all. I think we can safely say Australia will never be quite the same as a result of this crisis. What I want to address briefly are the following themes. Firstly, the Australian response in an international context, why this crisis, driven by a health imperative, is not a textbook macroeconomic crisis, and then some comments on the macroeconomic response, fiscal and monetary, briefly evaluating the major elements. Then some comments on the legacy of the crisis, and finally some suggestions about what reforms we should be adopting going forward. So the economic impact, as we know, has been devastating to economies around the world, regardless of their development levels. It truly is a global crisis. The world is now in deep recession, much worse than during the global financial crisis, and it remains to be seen just how long it will last. In our region, Australia and New Zealand have been hit harder than elsewhere due to our exposure to services and our dependence in particular on tourism and education. So Treasury is forecasting a 10% contraction in the June quarter and the unemployment rate to exceed 10%. I suspect it'll be more given the distortions that the JobKeeper program puts into the numbers there. So like governments abroad, Australia's governments, federal and state, have tossed out the rule book in this crisis. Central banks have massively increased liquidity, buying government debt at lowered interest rates, which were already very low by historical standards. On the fiscal side, there have been two basic approaches. adopted globally, particularly in advanced economies. Developing economies haven't been able to afford such measures, but in advanced economies, the fiscal measures have taken the forms of wage subsidies and income transfers to households and firms. The United States, the world's largest economy, essentially chose the option of income transfers, whereas New Zealand, UK and Singapore and other European economies chose the wage subsidies. Australia happened to choose both forms. So we've got income transfers and wage subsidies. So by international standards, Australia's response has been very generous and, according to the IMF, one of the most expansive in the world, near the top. So as I said, this is not a textbook crisis. The big question is, how do we analyse it using tools of macroeconomics? And the answer is we can't really. No university textbook analyses economy-wide shocks of this kind. And the best way to think about it, in my view, is to think of it as a government command and control management of a health crisis akin to managing a war economy. Usually in macroeconomics, we interpret shocks as either aggregate demand shocks or aggregate supply shocks. So financial crises, which impact on consumption and investment, or export shocks are demand shocks. Aggregate supply shocks come from productivity fluctuations, increases in wages, and oil price fluctuations. But conventional macroeconomics sees those as coming predominantly from the private sector. But the COVID-19 shock has come from government action, and it's been a shock that has simultaneously impacted on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So aggregate supply contracted first due to the supply chain disruption from China, and then through as a consequence of forced business closure due to lockdowns. Meanwhile, aggregate demand collapsed due to employment-related income loss, the lockdown restrictions limiting spending, and an overarching high uncertainty, which will remain a constraint on recovery for some time. So the monetary policy and fiscal policy responses, in my view, were necessary to support both aggregate supply and demand, but they feel most uncomfortable when it's called stimulus. The dictionary meaning of stimulus is action, any action that rouses activity. But in this case, of course, we're talking about policies that keep the economy effectively on life support. So I think the terminology should be with reference to fiscal and monetary support as opposed to stimulus, which I think is a misnomer. So let me just say a little bit about the JobKeeper wage subsidy program, because that's really the centerpiece of the fiscal response. First off, we've not seen anything like this, certainly on this scale in Australia. And its novelty is that it is a fiscal instrument that's directed to the supply side of the economy. It's not an Australian innovation, I should add, as it mimics schemes that have been adopted in other countries, New Zealand, UK and Singapore, for instance. It's very expensive, of course, and no doubt we'll learn more about the inequities and possible rorting that's gone on with the scheme in due course. There's a Treasury review of it due by the end of June. But in my view, it does provide a useful prototype. Heaven forbid that we have future such crises. And it's a preferable approach to standard Keynesian approaches whereby government spending is ramped up in particular sectors to increase aggregate demand, which can be ineffective. So what is the fiscal legacy? Well, we know that we'll have very large budget deficits at federal and state level for years to come. And a key question is it a concern? And this is where views differ. Even on this panel, my views would not be the same as Fabrizio's, for instance, suggesting that the debt is not problem. I would argue that it is, that the federal government debt estimated to double to over 1 trillion within a few years on a worst case baseline scenario, and doubling on a ratio to GDP of some 40%. This will undoubtedly threaten Australia's credit rating, AAA credit rating, the loss of which will increase interest rates, making debt servicing more expensive, and reduce Australia's attractiveness as an investment destination. One feature of Australia's debt, it may be relatively small compared to some other countries, but we borrow for most of it. Some 70% of Australia's public debt is owed to foreigners, and that means an extensive interest servicing burden in terms of interest paid abroad, which is a net drain on the economy. And in fact, it's a multiple of Australia's foreign aid budget and a multiple of many other federal government spending programs as it is. So that would more than double. It may be that interest rates will remain low, meaning that drain will not be as high as otherwise, but I think going forward, there's surely a strong chance that interest rates will rise given the call on saving worldwide by, by the budget deficits. There's also a huge risk to competitiveness from this legacy, as I've argued previously with respect to the fiscal response that followed the global financial crisis. This is something that textbooks do tell us, that if you're increasing public debt, then this can induce capital inflow that's consistent with Australia borrowing abroad for most of its government borrowing requirement. And of course, that will appreciate the exchange rate. So we saw in response to the GFC that the Australian dollar rocketed from what it was during the GFC to over $1.10 against the US dollar, a very sharp appreciation of the Australian dollar, which did great harm to manufacturing and other tradable industries in the wake of that stimulus. And that's consistent with standard textbook theories of how open economies behave. Of course, another risk is that central banks will monetize the debt extensively, that is, they'll buy up the bonds. History shows that maybe not immediately, but with a lag, that can be highly inflationary. And we did see fairly high inflation post-Second World War in some intervals as a consequence of this kind of behaviour. A worst case scenario would be a hyperinflation that has occurred in economies that have followed that type of monetary policy. In contrast, at the other end of the spectrum, the public debt could turn the world into a large Japan, in the sense that the high public debt that Japan experiences, it's over 250% of its GDP, by far the highest of any advanced economy, has been correlated with its anemic growth over recent decades. With a huge debt of that order that has to be rolled over, it means there's a big drain on saving every year, saving that could otherwise be directed to productive investment. So what reforms would I suggest going forward? This is a very big question that we could spend several more sessions on, I think, analysing alternatives. But let me just suggest the following. Firstly, on the fiscal front, on the budget front with respect to revenue, I think there's a strong case for raising the GST. Australia's GST rate is relatively low compared to other advanced economies, and Australia is more heavily dependent on direct taxes, that is income taxes, than indirect taxes such as the GST. So there's I think a strong case for raising the GST perhaps to 20% across all items. And there may well be a case for other income taxes targeted at the higher end of the income scale, including inheritance taxes, wealth taxes, and perhaps a temporary surcharge. But we wouldn't want to be targeting anyone that was badly affected by the crisis. On the other hand, company tax should not be an option, in my view, given Australia's current rate for large companies is part of the problem when it comes to our relatively low investment. If you look at the balance of payments accounts, you look at the external accounts, you see that in fact there's now net equity investment abroad, which means that we're just not attracting investment here. And one of those reasons must be that our company tax is way out of kilter compared to other economies. On the expenditure side, there really needs, in my view, to be a thoroughgoing review of outlays at both federal and state level. We had a major review of the tax system some years ago, the Ken Henry's review, that looked at all aspects of the tax system and effectively provided a blueprint for reform. I think there's such a case for a blueprint for expenditure, and it's something that could start immediately. And at the top of my list for expenditure scrutiny would be areas where there's overlap between the federal and state government. There is overlap in areas such as health, education, industry assistance. The Productivity Commission identifies billions of dollars of assistance to industry.
Sorry, Tony, to interrupt. May I just kindly ask you to wrap it up? Sorry, we're getting a lot of questions coming through.
Okay, it's about done. Okay. And also age pensions, means testing for the family home. So these issues have been raised before, but I think the circumstances now mean that we need to seriously look at those again. And lastly, let me conclude by saying just a few words about structural reforms. So what we've witnessed has been a sudden economic stop impacting the private sector predominantly, universities accepted. It therefore follows that recovery depends on a revival of business activity. Hence, other ways to incentivise business are to reduce the thicket of regulations that stifle enterprise. After all, most Australians are employed by business, so making them more competitive, including facilitating international linkages, international trade, is an obvious way forward. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you for our three speakers. So could I kindly ask speakers to put your microphone and your video on? We'll see if the system can cope with all of us being present at the same time. And I'm going to go through the questions now. We've had a number. Those of you who've asked questions, thank you so much. Some have asked more than one. What we might do is try and get through everyone's questions, and then those who've asked a second question, we'll return to those if we have time. So the first question is from Terry, and Terry would like to know, there are two problems that he's identified: the workers problem, so being able to retain, help businesses keep workers employed, and the business problem. And so the workers problem, Terry has asked, where could the government allow businesses to have what he called corona unpaid days? So where the government pays employees at an unemployment rate and the days are decided by government like holidays are. His second question is about the business problem, which he's asked, could it be resolved by the government purchasing 10-year vouchers of struggling industries and then reselling? Could this help the revenue keep flowing? If our speakers would like to answer these questions, that's great. If you don't want to answer all of these, that's fine. We've got many more that you can each have the chance to answer. Fabrizio, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Just trying to understand if there is an order or not. Look, I missed a little bit of what you said, Sarah. So I will take the part of the question that I have heard. It's inevitable that we need to make sure that there is a large and consistent program of wage subsidies. Now, I didn't hear exactly what the proposal was in this case. Maybe you can repeat it, Sarah?
So for the workers' problem, it would be to have corona unpaid days where the governments pay employees at an unemployment rate.
Yes. Well, that's a possibility. I have to say that I like the option that they're using in Denmark, that they're considering in Denmark, where the government has committed to paying 75% of the wage of workers in companies affected by the coronavirus for an initial period of 3 months. So like a very clear wage subsidies of this type, which obviously has a huge cost, as Tony pointed out. But its long-term implications and long-term benefits, in my opinion, are going to be much more significant because we avoid the costs of unemployment, the cost of dropping consumption, and the cost of having to go through a painful process of reducing hours and workers to then recruit more hours and workers later on. So the Danish option, in my opinion, is one that we should be looking at very carefully because it is, in my opinion, particularly effective.
Thank you. Renuka, would I be able to ask you a question from Eduardo? Is it possible that the current crisis can result in creative destruction? So we would weed out the inefficient businesses to give way to the more innovative ones. Did you hear me, Renuka? Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so the question was on creative destruction. Well, sad to say that whenever an external shock or a negative shock such as this happens, then therefore there is definitely the opportunity for inefficiency to die out. Because really what happens is that the most cost-effective, profit-seeking sort of businesses are the ones that will thrive. So yes, I do think there is that sort of opportunity for creative destruction to come in, perhaps to even fill a gap. So yes, would be my short answer.
Is there anyone else who'd like to come in on that question?
Well, we're probably seeing a lot of that happening at the moment, the creative destruction. I think there's a lot of innovation going on by firms just by necessity to cope with changed circumstances. I'm sure there'll be a long-term change in business practices. There'll be more people working from home. There's probably be efficiencies resulting from that. It could actually be a cost-saving measure. So yes, good question. I think it's actually happening, but it's something that will predominantly happen in the private sector.
Sarah, if I can jump in, I would agree that it's probably already happening, and it's inevitable in a sense that it will happen if we want to maintain long-term economic growth. And that's why it is important that we prepare the labor market to support this process of transformation. And hence my reference earlier on to active labor market policies that allow workers to migrate from the declining sectors to the emerging sectors. If we don't do that as a country, then we miss the opportunity of sustaining the evolutionary process that will lead to economic growth.
Thank you. Our next question is from David, and David would like to know, does the panel, so you'll all get to answer this one, and we'll start with Tony, then Renuka, then Fabrizio. Does the panel support the RBA going to slightly negative cash rates?
Well, personally, no. I think that causes too much of a distortion in the markets, and overseas experience in Europe suggests that it's not particularly effective. I think a more effective way of conducting monetary policy is to do what they're doing, and that is to buy short-term and medium-term government securities, which is monetization. It's just a question of getting the balance right with that, because overdoing it could well be inflationary. Not immediately, where we see that countries that do that often experience high inflation after some lag. But no, I would be opposed to the idea of having negative interest rates.
Renuka, would you like to come in on that one? Fabrizio, would you like to answer that question?
Look, I agree with Tony. There are distortions, and also I don't think that this would produce much of an impact. As I said before, central banks in general, and the RBA in particular, now have a job in terms of maintaining the liquidity of the system. I would also support something like a quantitative easing to maintain low the interest rate on bonds, on government bonds. But going down to a negative cash rate, I'm not entirely sure of the type of benefit that we will get. While instead we can very well see the distortionary costs that would imply.
Would I be able to then go on to the next question? Tristan has asked, do you think there will be any effects when the government cuts the job seeker payments back to the original rate? And why did they double these payments in the first place? You just want to raise your hand gently if you think you're ready to answer this one. Thanks, Fabrizio. Great.
I'm happy to, in the sense that my view is that the problem is the timing of when the program will be withdrawn. And as Renuka said earlier on, it's very important that we don't rush into withdrawing this program. It's a costly one, but it's one that, in my opinion, is producing what it is meant to produce. I would actually strengthen it also in terms of coverage. So my concern is very much about the timing, for how long we're going to keep it. We can't just get out of it too quickly, and that's when we would have massive negative impact. If anything, I would prefer to risk and keep it a little bit longer than necessary than the opposite, withdrawing it too early.
Let me just add that I think it's most unlikely that job seeker will go back to the former rate. I think it'll be somewhere between what it is now and what it used to be, because there were pressures beforehand to raise the job seeker rate. So it's really a question for government, and it depends on the timing of recovery when that actually happens.
Thank you. So we've got a next question from Grace. Renuka, can I quickly would you like to just answer and let me check that you're here? No? Okay, so Renuka might answer in the comments and I'll keep track of that for her. So Grace has asked, does the panel agree with a statement made by a social commentator that this government has not provided all the money it could, and what it did provide was too reluctant? And this was due to them being concerned about how they'd be viewed in the future rather than dealing with the state of the economy right now.
I'm happy to take it. I'm happy to take it, but I mean, I'm always going first, so I'm happy to go last.
I might.
Oh, here we go. Renuka's back. Please, Renuka, we'd love to hear you. Great.
Okay.
No offense, Tony and Fabrizio.
Okay, well, because the problem with the mic, so I thought I better get my, 2-bit word in. So I don't think it's very fair to say that the government is not doing enough. I mean, there's always something that can be done better, but it's also easy to, point fingers. But I would say that they can do more, and they're a bit hesitant and reluctant, but perhaps it's a more cautious approach. Because, with whole COVID impact, everything is dynamic, everything is changing. So it's about feeling along as to how much to do and what to do. So I don't think they're doing too badly. I think there was a poll, and it was that 93% of the people thought Australia was doing quite well, as opposed to something like 30-odd% for the US. So I do think the government is doing quite well.
Let me just also add that, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the Australian government's response is one of the most generous in the world. I mean, the budget doesn't have infinite resources, so I think it's probably reached the limit as it is. And I mean, I personally was quite staggered with the extent of the fiscal relief. It's the biggest package in history. And it's quite novel for Australia to have done what it's done. So yeah, they can always be more generous, but they're obviously cognizant of the fact that this is going to mean higher debt for future generations.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been disappointing if the government had done less. It's certainly be generous, but that's the nature of this situation. As I said before, fiscal policy has to step up as much as possible. If it doesn't step up now, then when? I mean, we are facing in such an unprecedented crisis that, in my opinion, the only risk that we are facing is not to do enough. And if that brings up the debt to GDP level, well, Tony and I will never agree on this point, so we could go on for ages. But even if the debt to GDP ratio goes up, well, that's justified in this situation. And Australia is in a much more comfortable position than many other countries to allow the debt to GDP ratio to go up. What worries me, as I said, is now the fact that there is some conversation, some discussion about early withdrawal of several of the measures that have been put in place. That would be a disaster.
Thank you. So our next question is from Joel. So I want all three of you to get your crystal gazing glasses on. And do you expect the world economy to recover quite quickly after a vaccine is created? And I think we should add there, we hope a vaccine is created. So who would like to go first with this one?
I'll just say a little bit about the prospects of trade. Yeah, I mean, the world economy post-GFC did not recover quickly. And one reason for that was that international trade did not recover quickly. International trade actually was negative growth for some years. And the international bodies, IMF, for instance, World Trade Organization, are predicting a worse outcome from this crisis. So international trade is likely to be reduced, and that's not going to allow economies to get back to normal very soon. So I think it's very important from an international perspective that we don't see a retreat to protectionism as occurred with the Great Depression. It was a reason why the Great Depression was so prolonged, because countries just retreated to protectionism, and we talk here in Australia already about greater self-sufficiency, and that's just code for more protectionism, and that's self-harming.
Renuka?
Yes. So yes, I do agree with Tony that it will take a while, and my concern is the retreat or going back to the previous trade tensions, geopolitical concerns, and stuff like that. And the fact that now with lesser trade, we're all trying to get used to doing with what we can or what we have, the self-sufficiency mode that Tony mentioned. So I think that's going to take a while and a lot of political will to come together and to be, more globalized and perhaps more interconnected. Because also this COVID situation has shown that globalization and more connectivity or interconnection can have the downside effects as well. So I think everyone will be quite cautious. But hopefully, the need to bring the economies back into place kicks in, and we do move a bit quickly. But I'm not very optimistic.
Look, if we look at the forecast of the IMF, we can see that they're predicting a rebound of GDP in 2021. What is not rebounding as quickly is the labor market. So the spike in unemployment that we are observing, not across the world, will not be absorbed anytime soon, unfortunately. And that's because what we were saying before, once unemployment goes up, bringing it down is very difficult for a number of reasons. So the long-term implications of this crisis will stay with us for some time, particularly in terms of labor market performance. I also would like to stress that the point of the question is very interesting because it talks about the discovery of a vaccine. And indeed, the discovery of a vaccine is an important step forward because, as I said before, in my opinion, this recession is not just a matter of containment measures. I would say that it's not primarily a matter of containment measures, but it's due to the virus itself and the uncertainty that it causes. And therefore, if you want a health solution to the problem, will only come when we have a vaccine or reliable therapy. At that point, probably the main source of the recession will be addressed, and that will open up the opportunity for a recovery, which, however, will be slower than obviously the drop that we have observed. So we have gone down vertically, the recovery will be much more gradual.
Thank you. Ashok has asked then, and this has been raised quite a bit in the news, I'm sure you're all aware of it, is how the post-pandemic recovery is going to impact the federal government skilled migration program. Tony, would you like to respond to that question first?
Yes, well, the outlook there for immigration is very negative, and I think it's a mistake if policies do deter immigration. It's a question of getting the balance right, but immigration's been very good for Australia, historically speaking. We get immigrants coming here who have already been well educated, many of them, which is a cost saving at the lower age cohort to the government, and proved to be most productive and a great boon to the economy. So it would be a shame if there was a curtailment of immigration for those reasons.
Yeah, I do think skill migration should be a bit more lax, but of course, given the government's initial stance with regards to migration, that might be a problem. But as we now have, the productivity is very low in any case, so skill migration would help, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I personally don't see any solid economic argument to justify a restriction on migration in this situation. The idea that there are jobs being lost and therefore by restricting migration we will facilitate the recovery of jobs, it doesn't hold true on economic arguments. So I would totally agree with Tony and Renaud on this one.
So we have now a question from Therese, who has asked, in regard to taxation, do you feel that it is inevitable that the GST will increase to, say, 15% rather than raising company tax, for example? Fabrizio, would you like to answer that first?
I hope that, sorry, thank you, Sarah. I hope that the GST doesn't increase. On this one, I'm in disagreement with Tony. I'm not a great fan of the GST, and I'm not a great fan of increasing the GST because that becomes a regressive form of taxation. I would be, I would think about the problem in a different way. We're going to have a deficit anyway. I don't see any reason to think now about increasing taxes. We have to pay for this deficit through debt or partly through monetization. Until then, we can rebalance our flow of revenues and taxes. I don't see the increase in GST as something inevitable. I think it can be avoided and it should be avoided.
Yeah, my view is similar to that of Fabrizio, because the implementation of the GST was really to make the tax system leaner and meaner. But I don't think we need to revamp that, and that's going to affect consumption and whatnot, so definitely not the way to go. Perhaps other forms of tax, like the inheritance tax and the wealth tax that Tony mentioned, would be a better way.
Well, I would disagree with both panelists on this one. I think the GST is basically a tax for the states, and the states are going to have major revenue problems. Commonwealth raises the GST, of course, but it passes it on to the states. And when New Zealand put up its GST post-GFC, the New Zealand Treasury and others in New Zealand did studies on the regressive or otherwise nature of increasing GST, and they found that that was not the case. In fact, that high income earners tend to pay a lot of GST. They spend on high-end items in their expenditure basket. So it's not necessarily the case that it's going to be regressive. As I said at the outset, it's the tax that we are lowly weighted on compared to other countries. We're heavily weighted on the direct tax side, on income tax side, less so on indirect tax. And as for company tax, the points I made earlier, I just restate that Australia's company tax is relatively high by international standards, and this is deterring foreign investment in the country, which historically has been a main driver of economic growth.
So we have time for one more question. It is 2 o'clock. I'm going to exploit the fact that the internet is still, hopefully, as Robin said, being our best friend for now, and try and do one more. Those who need to leave, I understand, but thank you so much for the question. So this question is from Anis, and they have asked, how much of an effect would declining house prices have on the Australian economy in the immediate future? Renuka, would you like to answer this one first?
So what was it? It was declining house prices
have on the Australian economy in the immediate future?
Well, it's quite inevitable that there will be declining house prices. So, and hopefully, with the COVID environment, the sort of recovery, that might actually increase the demand. So I think the effect would be quite positive.
Tony, would you like to come in then, Fabrizio?
Yes, I think it's highly likely that there will be a significant decline in house prices because of the uncertainty that exists across all forms of investment and spending. And of course, that will be impact on consumption because households treat the value of their house as part of their wealth. And so that is going to be another factor that's going to slow the pace of recovery.
It's interesting because just before starting the webinar, I was checking Twitter and I saw someone posting a tweet that actually housing prices outside of Melbourne and Sydney are holding and actually increasing slightly. Now, I would have to verify the tweet and you know, so I'm just reporting this. But yes, I mean, obviously, I suspect that over the medium term there would be a decline, which in itself is not a problem. I mean, this is something that we would expect in any contraction, in any, particularly in this one. As long as the banking system remains liquid and we avoid a situation where the falling housing prices leads to unperforming loans and therefore the type of credit crunch that we have seen before, this I would take it as an adjustment. There is, as Tony said, the risk that because of declining prices, the wealth effect would slow down the recovery. Again, the recovery is going to be slow and progressive anyway. And that's unfortunately the nature of this recession that we are observing today. So an orderly decline in housing prices wouldn't be too much of a concern. It wouldn't, in my opinion, make the situation worse in the sense that the situation is already bad and it will take time to go back to where we were before the crisis anyway.
Well, it is my pleasure now to conclude this fantastic recorded session. I really enjoyed listening to all of our three speakers. Could we please give them some nice feedback in your sections? You've got your little feedback, give them a nice happy face, I think, rather than the usual applause that you would get. Thank you as well to everyone who attended this. We were up to 108 people who were listening to our three speakers. So I think that is testament to, you know, how excellent this panel is and the amazing work that you've all been doing up to this crisis in this area, so that they wanted to hear your wise words on how we should move forward. So thank you again and take care and watch your.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the other panelists.
Okay, thanks all.